Right, today's lesson is going to be on sort of an introduction to UV mapping. UV mapping can be kind of frustrating, but there's some decent tools inside of Maya that make this a less frustrating process. I always like to talk about UV mapping in a way of just kind of like comparing it to the way clothing is designed. So you can think about how like the seams are stitched into a say a shirt. It goes under the arms, it goes around the neck. If you take that shirt that would be three-dimensional when it's wrapped around the body and lay it down flat and kind of open up some of those seams, you'll see how basically there are all these flat objects that then are stitched together. Well, UV mapping works a similar way. I'm just pulling up kind of a UV mapping image here from the web. I think this helps explain pretty well where you can kind of see this is actually a common graphic that you'll find out there that'll help you with your UV mapping of stretching, what's warped, what's not warped, so you can kind of read things easily. But over here on the left, you can see these numbered areas are wrapped around the body, and over here on the right, they're kind of splayed out and cut as if those seams are kind of laid out. And there's lots of different examples out there. Spend a little bit of time looking at UV mapping and seeing how they work. We're going to start off with some very basic geometric shapes. But obviously when you get into character design, you're going to understand. So this is just a nice little way of kind of like an illustration of how even a cube is kind of unfolded into the wrapper. So you can think about it as clothing and analog to clothing. You can think about it like wrapping GIFs with paper and wrapping them around an object. But how do we take a photo-based texture or a repeating pattern and then wrap it around a three-dimensional object, right? All right, well, let's get started. So first thing we're going to do is I always like to point out that there's a specific UV mapping workspace. So up in the top right, right now we're in the standard modeling. You can come down to UV editing and it just keeps everything very easy. It brings up your UV Toolkit here on the right, which has a lot of quick buttons to your common tools. It makes a flat 2D kind of editor, UV editor on the right, and then you can still see your objects on the left that you're working with, or your characters, or whatever you're creating. I'm going to start out with just a cube. You can see just making the cube right off the bat. I actually have, from previous lessons, I have my checker map on, but you might just see something like this, right? And this just represents how that flat texture would wrap, how the UVs wrap around a cube, right? 6 sides, and they kind of unfold, and one goes vertical and one goes horizontal. If I do turn on this little checker box up here in the top right of the UV editor, then that gives me sort of a nice preview of a repeating pattern and what that might look like, especially if I don't have any textures on my object yet. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Eventually we'll add a texture to this and we'll kind of see how it looks, right? So I've got I'm going to make this just a slightly more complicated object. I'm going to go ahead and right click on it and go to, go to face mode, and I'm just going to extrude this real quick. Let's go ahead and give this some angles to it. Bring it up a little bit more. You'll see it hasn't actually really added any more UVs to it because it started as a cube and that's all that it really understands it as right now. So I'm going to scale this inward just a little bit, and let's bring that up. Cool. Scale that down to a little bit of a pyramid shape. Cool. So we've got a little bit more like a little castle turret. Still working with flat planes, which makes this a whole lot easier than most patterns out there, right? So before we get into making custom UVs, I always like to show people that, there are some automatic ways to make UVs out there. So up here under the UV panel, if I click on automatic, I actually have to select the object. Hold on. Let me go back to object mode, have it selected, and go to UV. Go to automatic. It does its best, and actually over here on the right you can see it. I can click on each of these and kind of look around, and you can see how all these different surfaces, it definitely broke it up into a bunch of planes. Some of these are kind of stitched together, but it did a pretty good job of automatically cutting your UVs. It might not be exactly what you want. There's more efficient ways to cut this for sure, but I can manipulate all these UVs over here on the right, and that's part of this UV toolkit. So up here I can choose between vertexes, edges, and planes, and then I have a specific UV shell selector tool which will just select one specific tool. As I roll over them, you're going to see what's highlighted over here on the left, and it color codes them, which is really nice. So I could click on this one, and if I hit the scale button, you can see how it changes the scale of the pattern. So it's actually like increasing or decreasing the size of the texture based on me scaling that, right? And I might want to actually like rotate around to see it. Also, rotate is going to be your best friend on this, because this is what allows me, since that's a very like left, right, up, down pattern, just rotating it a little bit allows me to kind of get that straightened out if I wanted that pattern to be like that. Same thing over here on the right. Now this included the top with it, which is a little awkward. We probably want to cut that up, which is why I'll show you how to manually edit these in a minute. But again, I'm going to rotate this guy, make it vertical, right? And then I'm going to scale it to kind of match the size of the other one. And now I can start to play around. If I zoom in on here, I can try to play around and really get these edges to line up in an interesting way, or at least in a uniform way, I should say. So you can, you have to spend some time with your UV mapping to get everything just where you want it. The scale's not quite right yet. I'd have to keep, scaling this up a little bit more and a little bit more, but eventually we'd get there. And could have a pretty nice alignment of our UVs depending on the particular texture that we're working with. So again, I can lay all these out. I can also come over here on the right and I can do select. I right click to bring up this menu and select all and do layout. And that'll help kind of just organize all of your files so you don't have any overlap, and kind of bring them all into place for me. Right, so because sometimes you can get your overlaps. You can move these around too wherever you want. If I move up, you'll see that the pattern just continues around the grid here as I move my UVs around. So don't feel like you have to keep your UVs in one spot. You can definitely move them around. So automatic did okay. It's not bad. I'm going to go ahead and select all these and delete. Come back over here to object mode and just select my object. There's lots of other presets. There's best plane, which you can select a plane and then press enter and try to see it got them on this side, but this side they're all weirdly stretched, so we're going to undo that. There's different ones for different types of structures. There's cylindrical, there's planar, there's spherical. So obviously a spherical one's going to work really well on a sphere, a cylindrical one's going to work well on a cylinder. If I bring cylindrical in here, I actually get like a manipulation cage that allows me here on the left to kind of like interface and scale things. So if I did have a cylindrical object, very quickly I can do my UV mapping and make it fit. You see I don't have like the same kind of cuts over there that the automatic did. I have this kind of cylindrical cage that I'm working with. So I'm going to undo that. I'm just going to actually bring in a cylinder so you can understand how that would work, how some of these preset ones work pretty well. As you can see over there on the right, it was like two caps and then this one big kind of like cylindrical projection, right? So if I have a cylinder there, I can then come to UV and choose cylindrical. And that mapped it way better distortion-wise. And then I can play with these to decide how many times I want to repeat it, where do I want my seams to be, all of that fun stuff. And I can scale up and down and stretch them, right? So it really fits the object very well. Let's come to object mode there and delete that. Let's bring a sphere in. Whoop, wrong arrow. And just right off the bat, you'll see over here on the right, I just have sort of this weird like picket fence UV. But if I go to my UVs here and I choose cylindrical, that warps them correctly. I mean, it kind of brings them to a point up at the top, but it gives me this cage again where I can decide, like, how much do I want to repeat this pattern? Do I want to have one big one stretched over it? Where do I want the rotation of that to begin and end? So some nice tools there if you're working with basic shapes, right? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Let's go ahead and try to do some UV mapping now with a custom UV cut UV map for a particular object to create. So I'm just going to make something really simple. I'm going to take a cube and I'm just going to do a little bit of extruding on it real quick. I'm going to take the soft top here. Let's go ahead and extrude it upward. Oop. I want to grab it by the arrow. Let's scale it out a little bit. Cool. Extrude it one more time. And we'll go ahead and scale that inward. Alright, cool. Simple shape, but because of these little angles, it's not as easy as like the flat UVs that come in, right? They're going to be stretched, they're going to be a little bit funky, etc. I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to go ahead and put a texture onto this right now, because you want to put all your textures on your object before you UV map them, otherwise they're not going to be connected properly, right? So put your textures on, and so you can get your textures right. You don't want to do it try to do it after the fact. It's just not going to work. So I'm going to right click and assign a new material. I'm going to go ahead and create a Lambert, I believe. And then I'll come over here to my Lambert settings, and I'm going to go ahead and load a photo-based texture. So I'm going to go to File, and then I'm going to load this in. I have a stone pattern here. So right off the bat, you can see how those flat panels look great, right? It's repeating that, it's wrapping around it, but then as soon as it gets to those angles, whoa, what happened to my UV model? And it's because it's trying to stretch them over this strange form that it once thought was a cube, but now it's a cube with these kind of rhombus shapes that have been extruded out of it. So to get started, we're just going to kind of give a different type of UV projection. We're going to go to UV and go to camera based. That already looks a lot better, but it's not great. You know, we've got some weird warping there that's going on. The camera is just a kind of a starting point, right? So we are going to go ahead and use a special tool that's really awesome in Maya. If you go to UV and we come down to the 3D cut and sew UV tool. This makes life so much easier. You can see right off the bat it says drag to cut, control drag to sew. So that's a really useful tool. So I'm going to go back off of that again just so you can see it. Drag to cut, control drag to sew. So cutting and sewing, which is really cool. Control or command depending on what you're doing, right? So right off the bat, we're going to go ahead back to our UV toolkit up here on the right. We're going to choose edge mode because you can't do it in face mode. And we're going to do exactly what it said. First thing we're going to do is go ahead and just cut this top panel. So all I have to do is click and drag. And as soon as I get to this last one, well, almost did it. Sometimes it works a little better than others. Let me go ahead and click. If you need to click on an individual one, there we go. I had to just kind of click on the last one. It wasn't showing up. And it'll change a color for you. If it doesn't change color, make sure that this shaded UV in the top left is, if it's off like this, you're not going to get that color change to let you know. You will see that you have like that white, the edges on that section that you completed have turned white, and if all four sides are white, you should have a UV there. But I really love this shaded element. Turn that on because that kind of gives you this different color change that happens as you work through it. Alright, so I'm going to click back on my tool here. Click, click, click. And as soon as I got to those three, as soon as I just click and hold across them, click and drag I should say, as soon as I got to that third one, since the fourth one was already cut, boom, it automatically cut it into its own panel. So this time I only have to do two. There we go, I clicked on that. Sometimes if you have to click on them individually, it's fine. It'll eventually get there, right? So click. There we go, got that one as well. And this one I should just be able to do one. If I can get it to click. There we go. Automatically is changing color. So each color is showing you that it has cut that plane automatically for you, which is really convenient. I'm going to click on this and that. That shifted a little bit, not a ton, but it's definitely its own color now. I know it's kind of hard to see sometimes off of the blue. There, that one changed for me. Let me get this one. There we go. Sometimes just a quick little double click will make it. It's a good tool. It has a few little issues in my use of it, but it works pretty well. I'm going to get the bottom next. There we go. There we go. Now green. Now it automatically kind of cut that one, so I should be able to. Let's see. I was trying to undo that one. I really wanted to have these guys sewn back together. So if I click off of this, so I haven't used the sew as much. You know what? That's okay. One cut. I would love to get rid of this one. So let me see if I can. No, it's just not. I try command, I get my interface. So let's try. Whoop, sorry about that. Go back to object mode. I was going to try to sew it for you, but I'm not as good with that technique. So we'll go ahead and just finish these off. Let's get back on the drag to cut, control drag to sew. Oh, control drag. Okay, cool. Let's try that one. Control drag. haven't completely got rid of it yet, but oh, it's because I was in face mode. Let's try it in edge mode. There we go. So controlling that off got rid of that one. Because what I wanted to do was actually just make a single cut in this bottom one. Because it's rectilinear, I want that to actually be all one object right now, or I'm sorry, one UV that kind of wraps around like a big rectangle around that. You don't have to cut every single face into its own thing. So since that's all rectilinear, up, down, left, right, it'll be easier to control how that brick wraps around it if it's all one piece stretched around. I'll show you how that's going to work here in just a second, okay? Well, although looks like I did get rid of one there, so I want to fix that. But everything else looks pretty good. I'm pretty sure this is its own. Yeah, I think so. We'll find out. So now that I have cut all of my UVs, I'm going to come over here into my UV editor window. And if I right click, I can go to select and select all. And now we're going to unfold. So over here on the right, you might have had like your cut and sew panel open. But if you unfold here, and you click the unfold button, now everything has unfolded into its own planes. Took it out of that kind of camera-based projection and flattens them all out like little tile pieces now. But they're all kind of like stacked on top of each other, so it's really nice if you unfold the Arrange and Layout tab here and click on the Layout button. This will just sort of like orient them all so at least they're not on top of each other, right? So now I can come in here and I can start to manipulate these UVs just like if you're using some of the like automatic methods, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click on these, and you can either do it in face selection mode, or you can use on the far right here in the UV Toolkit editor just the UV selection, and then you can click on each of these. Now you do need to get off of the cut and sew tool, so let's go back to the selection tool just to deactivate that. Now I can choose each of these as we go through, and you can kind of see which face I'm clicking on as I move through them. They become highlighted over on the left, right? So if I want to start to manipulate, say, this bottom one that I was talking about that I cut into that one big rectangle that wraps around, now I can go ahead and hit E on my keyboard and bring up the rotate tool, and I can make these so that they're not at a weird angle, right? And if you want to move these yourself, you don't have to keep them in that one cube. They'll stay the same. You can just move them over to the right and give yourself more screen real estate to mess around with them, right? So now I'm going to rotate that just a little bit more, maybe try to get it as rectilinear as possible, like right there. That looks pretty good. And now I've got a pretty good, and they're wrapping around nicely on the corners. They look like good stones ready to go, right? So now I can say, okay, well, where's that bottom piece? There it is right there. Maybe that needs a slight rotation as well. And they're not quite lining up the way I want, so let's move these over a little bit. And that's actually looking pretty good on the wraparound. I could play with these for a lot longer. I could scale these up or down to try to make them fit a little bit better. And then I can get into my angled areas. Now you can't edit the UVs over here on the left. If I try to do that, then I'm just scaling the object, right? But if I come back over here on the right and do it, then I'm scaling the UVs. So I'm going to go ahead. You have to make sure you're in that UV editor. I'm going to make these rectilinear. I'm going to start to move these over and try to line them up so that my stones continue nicely as we go. And this is the beauty of, the tedious nature of working with UV editors, and particularly photo-based textures or shaders that have a repeating pattern in them, where you need to get everything kind of lined up just right. It takes time, but in the end, it really pays off because you're going to have this like beautifully seamless texture that goes all the way around your object. Now, see, like that was looking good there, but it doesn't look down good here. So you keep adjusting and moving and adjusting and moving and scaling and rotating, and eventually you'll get everything right where you want it, right? So this is just the basics of UV editing. This is custom versus doing some of the automated forms. You just got to kind of play with it, but boy oh boy does that UV 3D cut and sew tool, that really helps a ton for cutting and then also repairing with the sew tool by clicking on that control key. So have some fun with it, enjoy, and thanks for tuning in.